I'll be honest, I'm not going to say it for us to believe. It's going to be real hard to throw any stones at that. So. All right, just test right there. So, y'all notice I didn't say good evening to Lucille. She wouldn't have been listening and wouldn't have heard. I didn't want to embarrass her. So, good evening to everyone. We have, I believe, three lessons in our History of the Church series. So hopefully we'll finish these strong. Maybe an odd set of topics here this evening. They may seem a bit odd in that they're paired together. They're not so much paired together as much as they are together because of a time frame more than anything else. Our title for this evening is Civil War, Pacifism, and Instrumental Music. And so we'll put two of them over here, and we'll put the third one over here in the second thing. I want to say, though, beforehand, and I would say that for most of us, we would be able to say this, that we've never had in our lifetime war fought in our own yard. The closest thing that we could get, and some of you were young when this happened, would have been the bombing at Pearl Harbor. But that's a long way from the mainland, although there were many people that's American territory at the time and many people that were there. But the last war that was fought through your front yard was the Civil War. That's been 175 or some odd years ago since that took place. So we've never been in a situation where war was fought sort of here. We talked earlier in this lessons about how the religious wars that were fought in Europe spawned some change, but we talked about how in Germany about 60% of the population is war. That's never been something that's faced us. Our intention here this evening is in no way, shape, or form to relitigate a civil war. I'm not interested in talking about war at all, but I'll leave this, and I'll leave this quote because I feel like that this was the best quote by Ulysses Grant to sort of describe the Civil War. And unfortunately, it was about a 70, well, it was really about a 200-year buildup. That I would probably could argue that people of the same country is an unfortunate thing to take place. But the church and the Restoration Movement happens during the Civil War. And you have to exist within the world that you are living in. We've talked about this before, but we could insist on the same type of outreach that was done 200 years ago. It's going to be as effective as methods of outreach today. It would not have made sense to David Lipscomb or Alexander Campbell what Ben is holding right here in front of you. But once they figured it out, they would have said, this is an effective way to do things. And so when we're talking about what was happening within the church, it was happening during this war, okay? And anytime a war is fought, or anytime there's a disagreement, people dig into their own sides. People have their own opinions. In the church, the changing and the movements in the church were no different. We're going to talk about that for a little while here this evening. To start with, the United States had been building toward a civil war for 200 years. Essentially, the first day that people came to what would be the United States, a civil war started. And the reason that it started in part was because there were a couple of men brought in 1619 from Africa to be slaves. And that becomes a big issue for 200 years. Now, over time, the debate was whether it should or shouldn't be allowed. And I've put stuff up here that we're not going to talk about, but that you can see. But Congress was made to sort of help people, count people, who has power, who doesn't. All of these things were put in place. But down here at the bottom, this political buildup to a civil war was in many ways mirrored in the religious institutions, and especially the Christian church. And I use the term Christian church capitalized there because, as we've said, the title Church of Christ was still not really in existence there at the time. But this divide will be centered along a north-south division. A north-south division. Just like the Civil War was a north-south, the church will be a north-south division as well. You remember a couple of weeks ago when Alexander Campbell said that he didn't like how the Missionary Society chose the people because it was those 5 people from Cincinnati that picked it? That's exactly what this is, right? It's hard for us sometimes to recognize that. I want to read 3 verses here. These are all war-related verses, and I think you'll be familiar with all of them. Suann, do you care to read the first one, which is Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 8? That's within a series of verses from Ecclesiastes that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Throughout history, throughout the Bible, in fact, you'll see war taking place. The second one, Matthew 24 and verse 6. Melvina, do you care to read this one? And we read this, and we read, Jesus saying this, and we read how that there were wars that have happened, and there's wars that will happen. And you don't have to be very far into your television viewing or your newspaper reading to see wars or rumors of wars that'll always exist. And I like the last verse here because people struggle with this. It says the end is not yet. How many times have you seen something on TV or read about something happening like, well, it's going to be the end of the world? Well, that's been said, what's the story of the boy that cried wolf? When you cried enough, people aren't going to believe you. Well, it's the same kind of thing here. That's not. We're told that these are things that are going to happen. So war has existed, and there will be war in the future as well. Romans chapter 12 and verse 18. Mom, do you care to read it? This is not exactly from the Beatitudes, but that's Mom's favorite verse within the Beatitudes. It's blessed are the peace givers, peacekeepers, peacemakers. Why am I drawing a blank on that? I should have never even mentioned it. But as much as it's possible to live peaceably with all men. We struggle with this, right? It's sometimes hard for us to live peaceably. It's hard for us to live peaceably with the person sitting beside us. Sometimes not even as much the person who lives in another part of the country or another part of the world that we struggle with as well. But I wanted to see that this is happening. It had happened. It was continued to happen, and it still happens for us today. The word pacifism. How many of you have heard the word pacifism? Anybody hearing the word pacifism for the first time? All right, well, let me give you another word. How many of you know what a pacifier is? What do you give a pacifier to? Baby to do what? Getting quiet down. All right. So it's the same thing right here. You're wanting peace within it. It's the same thing with the Pacific Ocean. The first person that saw the Pacific Ocean in an incredible feat of wrongfully naming something said that it was a peaceful ocean. Well, that wasn't true, but it was Pacific because it meant peaceful. But it was. That's true. Balboa come across. I guess if you walked all the way across Panama, you'd have thought it was peaceful on the other side as well. But pacifism as the opposition or the resistance to war. So you could say I'm a pacifist and say there is no need for war to take place. Or you can also include pacifism to say that you disagree with conscription, which is a draft or a requirement. Now, some of you will remember that. You may remember back during the Vietnam War when there was a lot of issues about whether or not people should serve in the war or not. This was a religious issue then, and it became a religious issue even into the 60s. We no longer have a draft, and so therefore that issue doesn't really come up anymore. But there was an argument that brothers should not go to war with brother. And I'll use this word brother in a couple of different ways. We can use this as me and a sibling, but we can also use this as a Christian in one place versus a Christian in another. And you may think that we would use the word brother there, but we talk about our fellow brothers and sisters, right? We talk about the brethren in this location or that location. Those people are Christians as well. And so there was this debate, this question, if I fight in a civil war and I am from Alabama and you fight in a civil war and you are from Michigan, but we're both Christians, well, I'm not related to you in any sort of physical sense, but am I a brother to you in my religion? So that was a debated issue as well. Most of the early Restoration leaders were pacifists. They were older, with a little bit of experience, but almost every one of them, I didn't list all the names, but almost all the names of people that we've talked about the last couple of weeks, their sons fought in either the Union or the Confederacy, which means that even back 200 years ago, people weren't doing what their father said, right? That's probably not going to ever change either as well. But it's easy to say you shouldn't fight, but it's harder to not fight when other people are doing it. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. I should have let you guess before I popped it up here, but this is James Garfield. James Garfield was the 20th president of the United States. Wasn't that long? About a year. He ended up being killed, and so he's one of 4 presidents that have been assassinated. But James Garfield was the president of the United States, but at this time, it was what I'm using this word circuit preacher. That's not really a word that's used in Christian or disciples or Church of Christ, but I think you know what I mean. He preached from different places within the disciple church, but he also was a colonel in the Union Army. He would go and preach, and he would stand on the porch and would recruit people to join the military. And then he would go into the church and preach the actual sermons, showing that there was a divide in what he thought he should and shouldn't say in front of the group. But nonetheless, it was still his job to try and secure people to serve. For many Christians at the time, there's a distinct tension. You see it right here. They believed that a Christian had a higher obligation. Those 3 verses that we read a minute ago, they believed in those 3 verses. But it's also really hard to not get involved in something when everyone else is getting involved in it as well. It's also really hard to not get involved in this fighting situation. And this comes up within the church. And I want to say this. The church, we use this word as like this big entity, but each congregation is separate. And there may be a differing of an opinion in one congregation versus another, and that happens here as well. All right. Now, I'm going to go back to our old friends at the Missionary Society, because this is where this gets involved as well. The first wartime meeting of the American Christian Missionary Association happens in Cincinnati in October of 1861. Now, why are these things happening in Cincinnati? This is not a church question, but I'm going to ask you, why are they happening in Cincinnati? It was right in the middle of North and South. Anybody else? Why else? Right on the Ohio River. I also think it was the 4th largest city in the country in 1860, which is hard to grasp for that today. But it was sort of right there in the middle. So anytime, some of you all may have lived in Cincinnati or been born in Cincinnati or know people, been to Reds games or whatever it might be. But they met there, but only with northern representatives. See, this becomes a problem when we talk about missionary groups. You have all these people that come together, but in this situation, some of the people didn't come. So if half the people are absent from the meeting, do you think everybody's going to agree with what the meeting comes up with? We use the word quorum, right? You have to have a quorum. You have to have a greater than 50% to be present to be able to have a meeting, because otherwise something could get decided that people are not going to be in agreement with. They introduced a resolution calling on, quote, brethren everywhere to do all in their power to sustain the proper and constitutional authorities of the Union. Okay? Now, don't really fret about the quote too much, but this is the Northerners that were saying this. That was where the Union was. And so these other people in the South don't really agree with that. Well, you're now instituting sort of political issues within the church as well. Southern leaders, including this guy, Tolbert Fanning, we talked about him last week, is published at the Gospel Advocate. He His paper was saying, don't get involved. Pacifist, don't get involved, although his son was. But he said, stay away from it. It's what I was reading said that he was described as both heartbroken and angry because A, the church is getting involved, and then B, they're kind of breaking apart from one group to another. Last thing, just before the Gospel Advocate was forced to suspend publications for the entirety of the war, he informed his readers that the American Christian Missionary Society had adopted resolutions approving a wholesale murder of Southern people. Now, that's not true. That's not what they said. But have you ever seen somebody who maybe wrote something that was slightly exaggerated? Why do people exaggerate what they write, what they tell? You get the point across. It makes a better story, right? And you want people that are on your side to know how truly bad the other one is. So in many ways, this war is being fought in the paper before it ever was being fought on land. Now, the Gospel Advocate would not be published. Part of that was because it was a Southern paper and they lacked the materials to be able to produce things like this. It wasn't, they were not denied the ability, they should have the stuff to be able to produce it. Now, go a little bit further. 2 years later, in 1863, the Missionary Society faces rumors that it was disloyal to the Union. The reason why is because the church, the Christian / Church of Christ, was still tethered together. And they said, why are you still in connection with these religious people in the South? If you're supposed to be split up, you need to be split up. So they produced a second resolution denouncing the rumors as false and slanderous. And they said, we are 100% in support of a united state of America. Now, without many people present, a lot of people disagreed with this. Basically, what we do right here is you drive a wedge into a church that would never be fixed. There's a northern and southern religion. We've talked nothing about religion, but you've driven a divide. Now, can churches, even today, be divided over non-religious issues? Always are. Still are, even to this day. I would dare say that most of the issues that come up in a church are probably not religious, or at least maybe have a tint of religion, but it's more personal or political or something like that going forward. So the point of this is to show that you can sort of drive this wedge into something, even if it had nothing to do. We've not talked anything about like what they're preaching about or what they're singing about or anything along those lines. Now, the war ends. The Union is victorious. They reunite, although they didn't reunite with exact enthusiasm necessarily. So a couple of things here after the war. And I've entitled this Post-War Bitterness. Describe or define for me what bitterness means. Somebody in the back, tell me, what does bitterness mean? What does it mean to be bitter? Okay, somebody in the back. All right. You know, my front row people talk more than my back row people, son. Maybe some jealousy that can come in with bitterness as well. Anything else with bitterness? Any other bitterness? We can move to the front row now. Okay, good word that nobody's going to want to use. Okay, it's like a taste in your mouth. We know what, bitter coffee or something, a bitter food or fruit, Ben? So why would there be bitterness after a war? Yeah. So in my time in education, in my time dealing with people fighting with each other, sometimes one of the things I've noticed is if two boys get in a fight, that's usually it. There's very little bitterness. But when two girls get in a fight, the real fighting takes place after the fight actually took place. There's bitterness there within. I don't mean to paint with a broad brush, and I apologize for all of you all girls who I'm sure were wonderful at all times between the ages of 13 and 18. But there is bitterness that sometimes comes whenever there is conflict, and especially if you are defeated on one side or the other. In early 1896, Tolbert Fanning, he proposed the meeting of Southern Christians to counter the meeting that had been held of Northern Christians. He said they need to counsel together to assess the condition of the church. Now, this is, again, a group of people who have said, we don't like missionary societies working together. But they said, we are going to meet together right here. They held it in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville. And they had representatives from 6 southern states, but no one from northern states were allowed to attend, even though this is after the war. No one from a state above the Ohio River was allowed to attend. And ultimately, as we said a minute ago, that brotherhood between them, because now they are denying the same thing that the other group was denying from there as well. So we have this conflict here between the two groups. Boom, I want you to read here. This is First Chronicles. It's a little bit longer, and now, honestly, you might want to take your Bible out, guys, to look at this because it's a little bit smaller and it's a lengthy reading. But this is First Chronicles chapter 16, and it's verses 37 through 42. Now, what does that have to do with the Civil War? Well, it has nothing to do with the Civil War. But I wanted just to say that time is sort of continually happening. And the Civil War was fought across 5 Aprils, as the book was called, but it was fought from 1861 to 1865. And then when it was over, at least politically over, but it wasn't time. People still disagreed with each other. There was still conflict. But there's other issues that come up. See, you'll notice here, I don't really resolve anything here. The church wouldn't resolve that everything was going to be fine and dandy. But there's other issues that come up that were happening as well. In what we read right here, I want you to look at First Chronicles chapter 16, what we just read, and I want you to look at verse 42, which is the last little bit of what Boo read right up here. It says, and with them Haman and Jeduthun to sound aloud with trumpets, instruments of God. So see, when we look back on things, sometimes we think, wow, it was a war that was happening. And that's all anybody was talking about. But that's not the case. There were other issues that come up. And what that issue is what's seen right here. These musical instruments of God. In the Old Testament, musical instruments are used. It's very clear right here. So that issue is going to come up as well. That issue is facing people. And so it's not like, well, all they were doing is fighting a war. There were other issues that came up as well. And so this instrumental music issue is happening at the same time as the Civil War issue was going on as well. All right, and we're going to talk about a few things here this evening. We got a few things that we're going to read. I want you to make comments if you want to along the way as well. But instrumental, I'll maybe be able to pronounce it, is introduced by King David about 450 years after the Israelites left Egypt. That's what we read there just a few moments ago. The use of instrumental music is mentioned about 36 times. I say about 36 times because there's some it's a little iffy to tell is that actually what they're talking about or not. But 36 is still a large number. But it's not once mentioned in the New Testament. Okay? It's not once mentioned in the New Testament. So we have this division here sort of between the two. Now, organs. How many of you know what an organ is? You ever played an organ, heard an organ playing? Organs usually have a lot of pipes with them, right? You've ever been to like a real fancy old church or something? They might have 100 different pipes. I don't know how it works. I don't know how they play it or anything like that. But organs in the 15th century had started to be used in church. Now, this is not in America because America, as we think about it, doesn't exist in the 15th century. There's only Native Americans that were living here. But by the 1500s, this is a direct quote, an organ was found in nearly every, what is this word right here? In nearly every important church. Mel, what do you think that means? Found in every important church. Big one? What else might it mean? If it's organ, they said organs were found in all the important churches. Money. Jill, what if it weren't one in your church? What'd that tell you? You don't, y'all poor, not very important, right? And so so in many ways it becomes a what? What would we call this? It's like a status symbol right there. So it's not necessarily a religious base, but it's a status symbol for whatever would be used there. We talked about these guys a while back, but I brought them back here for this. Early reformers, Wycliffe and Huss, by the way, both died. Huss was burned But they decried the use of instruments. And they encouraged unaccompanied congregational singing. They said you don't need to use instruments. People need to sing. That was the words that they used. It was also a belief that was held by many Catholic parishioners as well, because we think about the about the Catholic Church and music, but a lot of regular people, we'll just use that word, that were worshiping, felt that it was important for them to sing as well. Martin Luther, our old friend from a few weeks ago, he had a little bit different opinion. He thought that reform of worship, meaning whether you have instruments or not, he didn't think that was as important as what he thought was more important was make sure that you were following the word of God or whatever. He said, the way you worship is a little different than what you're actually preaching about within the worship, though. A lot of his followers disagreed with him, but Lutheran Church would ultimately maintain use of instruments. This is just to show you that musical instruments were starting to be used 14, 15, 1600s throughout places. That's what we've said quite often. It's easy to teach these classes and act like it's all happening like tonight, or it all happened like in a span of 10 minutes, but this is hundreds of years that this was taking place. Now let's come on the boat over to America. All of us are probably familiar with the Pilgrims, right? Wore them black hats with the buckles on it, right? Buckles on the shoes. None of that's true, but it's fun to color those pictures when you're little. But the Pilgrims, or the Puritans, they were against any kind of instrumental music of any kind. And they're the first real religious people that come to America. They didn't want anything. How many of you have anybody ever read much about the Pilgrims? They hated everything, literally everything. All right? You would have hated them. They wouldn't have liked you either. But they were not in favor of really anything. But they didn't believe that instrumental music should be used not just in worship, but you shouldn't even be playing an instrument outside of worship. You shouldn't even sit down and say, you know what would be good right now? Let's play a little violin. You know why? Anytime that the Puritans were awake, they should be doing what? Reading their Bible and studying and meditating. Well, that's not good. The ghost of a Puritan has come down and said, you can't be doing that. We will get back to you. All right. So, while early in America, there's not a lot of instrumental music, over time that changes. By the 1700s, you start to see instrumental music in a lot of religious groups in America. And by the late 1800s, the Presbyterians were one of the last groups to accept adding instrumental music as well. But instrumental music in the early days of the Restoration, there's two reasons why it was not primarily used. Number one, there was a limited scriptural basis. We just said a minute ago, where in the scriptures do we find music used in worship? In the Old Testament. Where do we find it in the New Testament? We don't. So if you're going to use it, you've got to go back to the Old Testament, which that's a conflict in religion as well. Does the Old Testament live or die after Jesus? Well, that was a debated issue. Some people said yes, some said no. This might be an even more important one. The rural setting made accessing large instruments pretty difficult. I've read about, and you may have read about this too, but on the Oregon Trail, one of the first things they used to throw out, you know what it was? Pianos and organs. You know why? We got to go 2,000 miles and we're hauling this thing. No can do. Throwing that out, right? We lose the sentiment of that stuff once we've crossed about 18 rivers, right? You throw that out and we're not going to do it anymore. But where we lived in this part of the world was becoming more accessible, but it was not totally accessible. All right. So the controversy. Should instrumental music, be involved in churches or not? Well, in 1851, the question comes up when a reader asked, and this is a magazine or a newsletter, the Ecclesiastical Reformer. They said whether an instrumental music might not add solemnity to the worship. All right, so let's talk about this word right here. What would solemnity be, using your context clues here? We can't use the word in the definition. That's not going to work. Was it respectful, serious, quiet? Yes. Sure. So the question is presented, would it not add some solemnity to the services? Well, it's a good question. It might. It might, sometimes at 10:32, we need a little solemnity in here, right? We're all kind of, I can understand where the question comes from. The editor of the paper was against it, but he put it out in the paper and he said, I want to hear from others. I like this, actually. I want to hear what other people have to say about it. Give me some sort of scriptural basis or some thoughts on this. Don't just let my word be the lone word right there. Alexander Campbell, our old friend, he stated that if churches had no real devotion or spirituality in them, then instrumental music might be an essential prerequisite to devotion. He basically said, if you ain't real church, you might help a little bit, right? Might be. Maybe church is just sort of this sort of go and act a fool and chat it up, sort of a social occasion. Maybe the question of solemnity might be good. He also added that to all spiritually minded Christians, basically the people that were spiritual, he said aids like this would be like a cowbell at a concert. Well, if you go listen to, a symphony play and somebody starts banging cowbells on the side, that's probably going to take a little bit away from it, right? So what has he done in this argument here? He's giving you both sides of it, right? But it might actually be a negative on the other side. Which one of them's right, do you think?
So if you're not very good at church, you need to get right with yourself, to make this stuff. You don't need an aid to do that.
Okay.
Both of us both are insulting to people that have music. If hurting if you need music, you don't have much spirituality in you anyway.
It doesn't take much to take these two quotes for me to look at you and say, need it, don't need it. Need it, don't. What am I doing right there? I'm making a judgment on your solemnity, right? I'm making a judgment on how spiritual you are. Am I able to really do that? That's going to be really difficult, right? Because some of us are pretty big talkers, right? And some of us might say, boy, they need to calm it down. But some people don't say anything like, oh, that's exactly what. Well, maybe that's my preference. But is that necessarily the preference of others? No. He's straddling the fence here, and it's making a judgment call that would be very difficult. All right, let's talk about this thing right here. You are not far. Basically, everything that happened is not far from where we are. But this is an organ. All right, it's actually a melodeon. But this was at the Christian church in Midway, Kentucky, the first congregation to bring instrumental music into the Christian / Church of Christ. This exists today, I think, at that Midway University, where you can go see this thing. It's not very big. This is not a big piano. It's not an organ. It's not something that you would have ditched out on the Oregon Trail along the way. Dr. L.L. Pinkerton was the preacher at Midway. He introduces this small melodeon to the organization. Now, I'm putting these here one at a time because you're going to love his quote. The reason for it was the singing was so bad, according to Pinkerton, that it would, quote, scare even the rats from worship. Now, he's talking about his own congregation. He said, y'all are such bad singers that the absolute best thing we could do is put this thing in here to drown every one of you all out along the way. He said it would scare even the rats from worship. Now, not surprisingly, not everyone agreed. There's an elder in the church, Adam Hibbler, along with his slave, which probably tells you that all these issues are going on at the same time. Along with his slaves, they wrote the slave, singular slave, they took the melodeon out through a window of the church. They basically went in and stole it. The Bible talks about that too. And so they start thinking, like, well, maybe we shouldn't have stole this. So they take it and put it back in. Now, I don't know what the reason was for putting it back, other than I'm assuming they didn't feel like it was right to steal from the church. We talked about that on Sunday. But this is the first place. You ever been to Midway? If you've ever been over to Midway, Versailles, between Versailles and Frankfurt, great, beautiful little place. It's a little town. But this church was the first one. This was the first one of the Christian / Churches of Christ to introduce instrumental music. Maybe at Transylvania. Okay, I wasn't sure if it was at Midway College or at Transy, but so anyway, a little bit more about it. W.K. Pendleton, editor of the Millennial, what's he called? Harbinger. I get it wrong every time. He had replaced Campbell. He called the use of instruments a mere expediency, meaning what? Convenient. Makes it a little better, right? Helps out a little bit. Moses Lard, whose paper was called Lard's Quarterly, he called Oregon, quote, a and pious innovation on the simplicity and purity of the ancient worship. You got two people here, right? First person, for it or against it? For it. Second person, for it or against it? Against it. Third person, David Lipscomb in the Gospel Advocate. He replaces Tolbert Fanning as the writer for it. He had little to say about it. He said that while there was bitter controversy over its use in the North, churches in the South are already opposed to it, so it's not even an issue. I say this 3 quotes for a reason. With almost any issue, you can find people on every single side of it, right? For one person, yep. For the other person, absolutely not. For David Lipscomb, this isn't an issue in our part of the world. Well, part of the reason it wasn't an issue in their part of the world is the North and South had sort of split from each other. And 50 churches out of about 10,000 Christian/Churches of Christ had organs, although that number would increase dramatically starting in the 1870s. That would be one of the issues, but not the only issue why in 1890 you see a definitive split between the two groups. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10. I think we've read this a few times. Leland, do you care to read this, sir? I've used this verse a few times. For what reason, would you say? To promote unity. Almost everything that we've talked about over the course of over the time in the course has been splitting apart, breaking apart for various reasons. Why does the Restoration Movement suffer division? Well, there's 3 things that I want to finish up with here this evening. 3 primary reasons. 1, 2 antagonistic interpretations of what we would call the restoration principle. And antagonism would be conflict with each other right here. Number 1, Alexander Campbell had formulated a strict view in the Christian Baptist when he insisted that the New Testament was a blueprint for the church and any practice not specified pattern was forbidden. Martin W. Stone had said, we'll speak where the Bible speaks and we'll be silent where the Bible is silent. But it wasn't long that this denominational mentality starts to creep in. In many ways, Campbell is one who brought it in a lot of ways. And these things, as we said a minute ago, as expedients, started to be added to the church. And this divide on missionary societies, divide on instrumental music, and yes, divide on war as well brings about division. Number 2, sectionalism and civil war bitterness. I live here than you who live there. One of the things that drives me nuts, and I don't know, but it drives me nuts, is when I hear people talk about SEC football, and they're like, well, they're good because they're in the SEC. And the reason they say that is because they all live in the same place. Our stuff is better than your stuff. Any basis for that? I said it, right? But do we ever do that with anything else? Is our stuff better than your stuff? Because it's how we do it. Or it's very dear cousin, that's how we've always done it, is often it's never too far away as well. But that divide of any hard feelings, they just said, we don't like this. And some people said, we do like this. But anytime there's a crack, well, let's think about it this way. Think about your concrete in your driveway. Is that little crack that appears, does it ever fix itself? It never fixes itself. What happens to that crack? It gets worse, right? That tiny crack gets much worse as well. And so this segregation, this sectionalism, this divide sort of breaks apart the groups as well. Last thing is that a lot of differences among people. The further you are from people, the less like them you are. Yesterday, Will and I went to UK basketball game. And we were in the upper deck. We're in the second row, and the person sitting right behind us on the third row was there with his wife or whoever, but she had gone to the concession stand. This is before the game had even started. And they did a little quiz on the screen. It would pop up. There's 10 questions, and they were all sort of New Year's equivalent. And one of the questions that popped up was, In this country, it is ceremonial to stand up on a chair on New Year's Eve. Give us 4 options. I don't remember what 2 of the options was. The correct answer was Denmark, but one of the options was Iran. And Will and I are sitting there and just kind of guessing along. Some of them we got right, and I was like, Iran. After 10 seconds runs off, Denmark lights up green. That was the correct answer. And the guy who's sitting behind me, who I'm not even talked to, he said, Iran. Well, y'all have responded, honestly, a little different than I would have thought right there. Why did he say that? That's a negative. He's made something up. Like, every place in the world has chairs, first of all. That guy's never been to Iran. Only thing he's ever heard about Iran, I can almost guarantee, is what he's heard presented on certain types of media. That's the only thing he's ever heard. But you made a statement about a group of people that you know nothing about. We laugh, but we do the same thing. But those divisions, when we're further away from people, the people that we're closer to are the right ones. And the people that are further away that we don't have to deal with very much are the wrong ones. That happened within the church as well. Double things. The fact that some people lived in cities and the fact that some people lived in rural areas a long way from everything made their opinions quite different on issues. More liberal thinkers, a looser interpretation. This is a constitutional term. Some of them, a more narrower, a stricter constitution. Do we follow it by word, every single word, or do we divide it a little bit? Well, it's easy to sit here and say one group said do it exactly this way and one group said do it exactly the other way. That's not even true either. Because we're a little stricter on some things, but we're not strict on everything. There's some groups that are strict on it as well. But the point of this is that these issues still exist today. All of these issues that we've talked about, all still exist today. Now, do the topics change? Yeah, we don't really worry about war that much anymore. But they were worried about it back then. But are there other topics that maybe rise up to fill in the place of war? We don't talk a whole lot about instrumental music, but are there other issues that maybe rise up in churches that exist today? Yeah. But quite often when these issues arise, we don't go to the Bible, we go where for our answers? Right here and right here. I think, I feel. And we don't always go to the scripture for it. And so the point of this is to show that the church, over issues that in many ways probably could have been resolved or been closer to resolved if they'd communicated with each other. But they sort of broke apart into other sections and they broke the church apart with it. It's our last point for this evening. I didn't let you talk much because I didn't ask many questions, but I'll let you ask questions or talk now if you so desire. Sure. Sure. Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. That the war ends when it ends, but you carry that stuff with you and it spills over into other things. It's easy to come into, I'm here for church, but my opinion, your opinion are vastly different on this. Well, if you say the wrong thing or I say the wrong thing, that could break people apart as well. And the church had to deal with that. We're talking about this tonight from like the Christian / Church Christ issue, but the Baptist church was split completely on this. The Presbyterian church is split on this. The Methodist church was split on this. Basically, every religious entity split over the Civil War. The only one that didn't split was the Quakers. Everybody else completely split over the war. So this is not only happened to a certain group of people. This happens to a lot of different groups of people throughout the country. Yeah.
Old Testament and they have this institution of slavery.
Mhm.
So we did advocate, but we should have practiced slavery. Because it really did get things done. And that's what people did do. And certainly we would say that's, we're not doing that. And if you're looking at the Old Testament, if you're an authority to do something, you have to look at it.
And then too many times, this is what it is, as time goes by, then this group of people are gonna do what they've done. This group is what this group is, because it's tradition.
Sure.
And you have to go somewhere to divide tradition from what is real and the truth. That's why you
Sure.
don't go by tradition, what tradition, you got to go to the Bible and say, do this, not, for the New Testament.
I believe that whenever there's a question about something, you always go back to the source. The source of the New Testament, our worship is the apostles. Jesus gave them, so whatever you establish will be established. They forbid it. It was not allowed here in the early church, first century church was not allowed here. Don't know why, care. That's what they said, this is what it's supposed to be. So go back to the source, stick to the source, and you'll always protect your authority.
Wonder what the apostles would have thought if they'd went to the Midway Christian Church in 1860, though. Sounded bad, the rats. They said they sounded so bad, we'll change everything along the way. Thank you all for everything this afternoon.